Ernest Hemingway was an extraordinary man who sometimes said ridiculously misleading things. "My writing is nothing," he once remarked, according to Edmund Wilson. "My boxing is everything." What really was most important to Hemingway, more so than anything else in his life, was the quality of his art and his claim on the future that it be regarded as literature. We're about 50 years away from the emergence of the Hemingway style now, and that seems a fair enough distance to measure its permanence. A variety of ways to do this, of course, but here at Roundtable tonight, in this last of our series on Ernest Hemingway, we've asked three of the best writers around just to come in and measure the man's work in their own terms. How good was he? What influence, if any, did he have on them? What of his work has endured? I'm Harold Hayes, and our guests are Ralph Ellison, James Jones, and William Styron. Gentlemen, let's talk about the degree of influence that Ernest Hemingway has had on all of you. And Jim, may we start with you?
Well, he's certainly been a very strong influence on my prose style. I started out emulating Thomas Wolfe when I first decided I wanted to be a writer. Soon after, I got into studying Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Faulkner also. But I think one of the major things that Hemingway contributes to a writer's study of how to write is his brevity and how he can create a scene with so few words and so little dialogue, actually. He doesn't write long paragraphs of dialogue like so many writers do. They're mostly one-line dialogue exchanges, and yet he has an extraordinary ability of making you seem to actually hear it when you're reading it. And I think this and his ability, his transitional ability and the brevity that he used, I think he's changed all writing that came after him. He and Dashiell Hammett and a couple of others.
Bill?
Well, I subscribe to that, what Jim said. I don't think that his influence on my own writing is probably as marked as it was on Jim and some other writers. In fact, reassessing him personally, I do not think that Hemingway has the stature or the power and the ultimate, let's say, grandeur as a literary artist as, let's say, William Faulkner. But certainly, any writer of this generation is probably telling a falsehood if he does not admit to being swayed in one way or another by that wonderful lyricism, that brevity that Jim talked about, that really remarkable simplicity.
What about an attitudinal thing? For example, the phrase grace under pressure, which is something that we have come to identify with the whole body of Hemingway's work, and his concentration on that particular attitude and theme, rendering of it. Wouldn't that be an echo in anything that any novelist would try to do today in terms of war?
I don't think so, no. I think the whole concept of grace under pressure is a faulty concept. I think Hemingway was enamored of this in a very strong way.
Faulty in what way?
Well, most of the heavy pressure I know around war is has very little grace around it, very little grace to do with it. In modern war, you don't have the proper audience to have grace. You get killed and nobody pays a damn bit of attention, or nobody cares. This is the hardest thing you have to live with in modern war. And I don't think Hemingway ever actually got into that kind of a position. He was either an ambulance driver or a newspaper correspondent. He never actually fought as a no-name infantryman the way I did.
Well, in fact, he did. There was the latter part of his military period. He was an infantryman, wasn't he, Ralph? It's my understanding. He went back into the Italian Army after
he went back in, yeah. But if you don't restrict the term to warfare, but use war as a metaphor for the human condition, then it would seem to me that the idea of grace under pressure is quite valid, and one which was sort of around in the American culture precisely because there was so much to frighten the hell out of you. When you take boasting and the American kind of straight-faced bluffing, there's the concept of grace under pressure operating there. Even the sticking out the chest and saying that we're superior to the English, say, is somewhere in the background of that attitude, and I would think that taken as a personal attitude with which to face the world, it's very much around in businessmen as well as in soldiers under the old type of warfare.
Well, I wouldn't quibble with that, but I know a lot of professional soldiers, and they take courage, which in essence is grace under pressure, I think, or part of it anyway. Style and courage together make grace under pressure, if you want to use it that way.
Yeah.
I know a lot of professional soldiers who don't think about it, and the mere fact that they take courage and grace under pressure as tools of their trade, not something to build a mystique on, just as they take physical fitness as a tool of their trade. And I think to build a mystique around that phrase is somehow, it gives it too much emphasis, perhaps.
Let's talk just a second about the style of the writer. We were talking on this show not so long ago and about the fact that you had copied Hemingway by hand to get some sense of the rhythms of his sentences.
Oh, yes. Well, that was when I had blundered into writing. I didn't study writing as such. I was a musician. And I found that certain things were happening in Hemingway, which I found moving, but I couldn't understand why. So one way of trying to solve the problem was that I just take passages which involved me, and I would type them out. And then I began to notice the work of the repetition, and then gradually to understand that what was not stated on the page was what was moving me, what gave
Did you
the
come
power.
on these just discovering them for yourself, or had you
Well,
read collaterally? Because these are truly themes that he and Gertrude Stein discussed. In terms of
Sure. Well,
evolutionism.
it worked that way, and I began to read criticism, of course, and read other things that he had written. This started with the stories, and I began to discover what was happening. That is, there was a philosophy which didn't show. And so it was my task to discover what that was. And that, along with those things which Jim has just described, was also very important because at the time I was reading any and everything which was fictional and some not fiction, and very little was so telescoped, so compact in its style. And that in itself gave you a feeling that you got when you heard, say, a good jazz musician taking a theme and getting the essence of it, you know.
Imitators can't do it.
No.
It's strange. They can't get the emotion in it. They can't move you the way the Hemingway brevity does.
That's it. I think Hemingway performed a very important function historically for prose fiction in that he really did take, if you examine the period in which he emerged as an important writer, he took the writing out of the province of the genteel.
James, I guess, would that be the
Well, he would
most
have been the
direct
towering predecessor, but he also took literature out of the province of, pardon the expression, ladies, ladylike writing. Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, who won one of the leading literary prizes the year that The Sun Also Rises came out, when Hemingway was almost an unknown. In other words, he came around from left field and brought this amazing, strong, muscular lyricism to American prose at a
It
time.
certainly broadened American prose just by virtue of that alone, I would
Yes,
say.
it had been dominated by some very good, James being a good example, some masters, but nonetheless, people who were looking at life in a rather conventional way, and Hemingway broke through on that.
Also, the told, he changed the idea of the told story, where it's told in prose rather than acted out in front of you, too,
Depicted. I quite
which
agree.
is very important.
But even more important, I would think, and this bears upon what you've been saying, Bill, is that here was a writer who tried to bring back a closer correlation between the literary style, how the words were set down and how the sentences and paragraphs were constructed, and the morality in society. And I think that this is his great contribution. And that scene of the retreat from Capreto and Farewell to Arms, I've heard people recently taking that as sheer cynicism, but it was, I think, a moral gesture, because he tried there to deflate so much of the political rhetoric, which was inflated, overblown, and hypocritical.
Be very in keeping with Vietnam, wouldn't it?
I would think so. Indeed, it would be a good thing for all politicians to read that.
Some of the criticism has been that these limitations were one of his problems. That is, he never really moved beyond the lyricism of youth as against the always present specter of death. I mean, it was this tension that really involved him throughout his whole literary career.
Well, does one have to move beyond? I mean,
I think it was when he tried to move beyond that that he began to get into trouble, myself. I think, well, take that fantastic story, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. Nothing happens except two bartenders are standing waiting to close up this bar in Spain somewhere, and there's an old man who tried to kill himself the week before. Nobody knew quite why. They were waiting, and one of the waiters is impatient, and the other waiter is trying to be genteel to the old man. And it's a fantastic story. It says very little. The old man gets up and walks away under the streetlights and the shadows of the leaves on his face. And it's fantastically moving. That was the tension of death.
sure.
Yeah.
That's where he does the Lord's Prayer. Nada is nada.
Nada, nada, nada.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time Harold, you mentioned his style, and I think that he had an unwitting negative effect on a lot of writers, because perhaps even he didn't know it, but he was the only master of the style of which he had perfect mastery, and that it led an unfortunate number of other writers to believe that it was something easily acquired, that this simple and even sometimes almost simple-minded prose could be something you yourself as a writer could absorb and put down. This gave rise to a most incredible number of very mediocre writers. As I say, I don't think I think Hemingway, had he known what he had brought to American literature, would be unhappy about it.
You can't blame him for that.
No, you can't blame him.
Can't blame him for the other.
No,
But you had some good ones derived from him, too. When
He
you
had-
say Irvin Shaw surely has a literary debt to Ernest Hemingway.
Yes, but I think Irwin is a good enough writer in his own right to have brought other dimensions, other insights, and other density at his best. And at his best, I think he's very good. But I'm talking about that extraordinary, absolutely inimitable way of looking at things which Hemingway had, led so many other writers to believe that they could do it too, and they just couldn't.
I think that where they went off, but attempting to imitate what was something highly original and which could best be used to point a direction. I just worked my own way through, not imitating. I don't think I ever published an imitation of Hemingway, but I did try to learn from him. And then I was drawn back to my own background. I realized the kind of understatement that he used would not work for me, that I'd be throwing away all of the marvelous American Negro idiom,
Sure.
which has its own uses and has its own implications, has its own resonance. But how to get the dialogue to fall, how to make the lines sound, I learned from him, as I think Faulkner learned certain things about dialogue.
In fact, may I just put in I wrote a review not long ago of Malcolm Cowley's really wonderful book on the lost generation. And I remember an anecdote that Faulkner, I put this in the review, an anecdote that Faulkner had told Cowley, expressing his debt to Hemingway, and simply saying, yes, in fact, there was one short story called Red Leaves,
Yes.
in which he puts some of Hemingway's Spanish dialogue into the mouth of these Indians living in Mississippi in the early part of the 19th century. And he does it beautifully.
He certainly does.
And I've always thought it's a marvelous sense of continuity when a man so much as himself as Faulkner could have magnanimously expressed his real debt to a man like Hemingway, who was a totally different writer.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask the three of you, what did you learn not to do from Hemingway? Bill?
Well, as I say, I think as lyrically fetching and strong as Hemingway's style is, it's something that, as I just now said, it's an inimitable style, and that as clear and as evocative as it is, it's something that a writer cannot afford to let himself try to imitate. And so I had to go on to other models. And I think any writer who is honest will have to admit to influenced by lots of other writers. And I don't think it's a unimportant thing to have to say that we're all the product of our forefathers. But I went on to other models, just as Jim, I think, did, and Ralph. I got deeply immersed in Faulkner, and I think I shook loose of the direct Faulknerian influence, but nonetheless I would have to say that for me personally as a writer, Faulkner and even Fitzgerald were stronger influences on my own style and my own work.
Well,
than
what
Hemingway.
about something like the excessive melodrama or a structure of novels? Jim, did these things speak to you in terms of what to leave out or what to...
At that time, no. But what impressed me was the ability Hemingway had to write about a scene and leave out an enormous lot of the detail. Now, you get into this problem then, which becomes very esoteric, which is called the selection of detail. Well, you just can't say, well, I will take this detail and that detail and this detail, and that will give the scene. You don't write it that way. It has to come out of your own belly and your own emotion and what you feel about the scene. But I study him very carefully, and as Bill said, I also, I hope, have shaken free of him as I have. But all of us, we take what we learn from the older masters and sort of amalgamate the whole thing into an alloy which becomes our own, finally, becomes our own voice.
Well, it's worth remarking that Hemingway himself, at the age of 16 or 17, directly imitated Ring Lardner. That is, he wrote his high school newspaper columns in the style of "You Know Me, Al." And subsequently, Lardner asked him to sign a book for him. And he acknowledged his debt to him at the time that he was a kid reading Lardner in, I suppose, the Chicago newspapers. Ralph, what do you see as a limitation to his work, which is a flag to you to move in other directions?
Well, it wasn't so much an imitation of the art, but a limitation of vision as concerned my particular background, my sense of American life. I could not restrict my view as narrowly as he could and work within that frame, because what he could understate, I had to yell at the top of my voice just to get somebody to say, hey, this is...
Except that you use understatement in your book.
Well, I do use understatement, but I had to
But I think that
it.
limitation is true. I think all of us champed at the bit of the Hemmingway limitation. None of us could have stood it. None of us could stand it. And I think that's why all of us moved away from him, having taken what we could from him, you know.
But I'll tell you this, Harold, one of the things that I learned from him, which hadn't to do directly with writing, back during the Depression in Ohio, when I had to shoot birds, hunt, I learned not to rush the shot from Hemmingway.
Yeah.
Well, he had this extraordinary ability as well, as which has been pointed out, to write precisely about how to do things.
That's right.
One of his letters in Esquire was supposed to be how to drive through a snowstorm, exactly where you put the pressure on the wheels and so on. And he made it a point to study these things to the degree that he could, with great authority, tell his reader what it is he wanted him to know. We have, incidentally, about 2 minutes of Ernest Hemingway's acceptance of the Nobel Peace Prize, which is interesting, I think, because it causes the novelist to commit himself to some of the very questions that we've raised tonight about him and in the course of the last 6 weeks, or 6 shows, rather. So, why don't we go out with the last word from Ernest Hemingway, telling us what he thinks about these problems of enduring.
No writer who knows the great writers who did not receive the prize can accept it other than with humility. There is no need to list these writers. Everyone here may make his own list according to his knowledge and his conscience. It would be impossible for me to ask the ambassador of my country to read a speech in which a writer said all of the things which are in his heart. Things may not be immediately discernible in what a man writes, and in this sometimes he is fortunate. But eventually they are quite clear, and by these and the degree of alchemy that he possesses, he will endure or be forgotten. Writing at its best is a lonely life. Organizations for writers palliate the writer's loneliness, but I doubt if they improve his writing. He grows in public stature as he sheds his loneliness, and often his work deteriorates. For he does his work alone, and if he is a good enough writer, he must face eternity, or the lack of it, each day. For a true writer, each book should be a new beginning where he tries again for something that is beyond attainment. He should always try for something that has never been done or that others have tried and failed. Then sometimes, with good luck, he will succeed. How simple the writing of literature would be if it were only necessary to write in another way what has been well written. It is because we have had such great writers in the past that a writer is driven far out past where he can go, out to where no one can help him. I have spoken too long for a writer. A writer should write what he has to say and not speak it. Again, I thank you.